Somewhere in a warehouse outside Birmingham, England, in the winter of 1945, there was a letter addressed to a young soldier who would never read it. It had crossed the Atlantic by microfilm, shrunk to a thumbnail-sized image on 16mm film, and been printed back to life on a 4x5-inch sheet. It had waited in a cold aircraft hangar, stacked beneath 10,000 others just like it, for months. By the time anyone got to it, the man it was meant for had been dead for weeks. The letter is invented. The soldier is a composite, one of the hundreds of thousands. But the warehouse was real, the backlog was real, and the story of what it took to deliver letters like that one to the men who were still alive to receive them is among the least told stories of the entire war. This is the story of what mail meant in the Second World War, and of the 855 women who crossed an ocean in secret, in uniform, fighting 2 wars at once to make sure it kept moving. Before the United States entered the war, no one had fully reckoned with what it would mean to move a nation's love across 2 oceans simultaneously. Once the drafts began and the troop ships sailed, the arithmetic became staggering. By 1945, the Army Postal Service was handling more than 2 billion pieces of mail in a single year. Sailors off Okinawa, paratroopers in the muddy fields of Belgium, infantrymen who had crossed Omaha Beach on board Luck and were now grinding through hedgerow country without a letter from anyone in 3 weeks. Bomber crews flying over Germany at 25,000 feet, one flak burst away from not coming home, who had not heard from their mother since November. Every one of them was writing home, and every one of them was waiting. The average American soldier wrote 6 letters a week. He wrote to his mother, to his wife, to a girl he hadn't stopped thinking about since he boarded the train. Each letter, once it cleared the censor's pen, and the censor was thorough, blacking out unit designations, dates, place names, anything that could help an enemy calculate where American forces were massing, was photographed onto 16mm microfilm, rolled by the thousands into a single canister, and flown across the Atlantic. The whole sack weighed less than 50 pounds. On the other side, the images were printed back onto paper at a quarter of the original size, slipped into envelopes, and bagged for the front. One mail sack could hold 150,000 letters that, sent as paper, would have filled 37 separate bags and weighed more than 2,000 pounds. The system was called V-Mail, Victory Mail, and it was a logistical miracle. Between June 1942 and the end of the war, more than 550 million pieces of V-Mail were delivered to servicemen overseas. They sent nearly as many back, but miracles require maintenance. Letters took anywhere from 1 to 4 weeks to reach a soldier overseas. In that time, an infantryman might change position a dozen times, get transferred, get wounded, or get killed. The Postal Service tried to track every man. Usually it did, but the war was moving fast in 1944, faster than anyone had expected, and the mail was always one step behind. By the time the push through France had swallowed hundreds of thousands of additional personnel, the backlog had stopped being a nuisance and become a crisis. For the men in the European theater, the letters simply stopped coming. Not a trickle, nothing. One day the mail was there, and then it was not. And the silence that followed was its own kind of wound. Morale officers understood exactly what that meant. The Army knew the formula by then. Mail was second only to food in what kept a fighting unit functional. In April of 1943, a corporal stationed in North Africa described mail call in a letter to a friend back home. The way men pestered the truck driver all day just to see if the sack had come. The way those who got nothing would pretend they hadn't expected anything anyway. The way the whole business produced a beatific look for hours in the lucky ones. No mail, low morale was not a slogan. It was a diagnosis. And by late 1944, a vast portion of the fighting force in Europe was presenting with it. The problem had a location. In Birmingham, England, in warehouses that had been bombed and repaired and pressed into military service, the mail had piled up into something close to geological. 3 years' worth of correspondence, letters that had been censored, photographed, printed, bagged, rerouted, lost, recovered, and stacked again, sat in heaps no one had the personnel to process. Some of the undelivered mail dated back 2 and 3 years, written by men to their families and families to their men in 1942. When the war had still felt like something that might end quickly, one general looked at the warehouses and estimated it would take 6 months to clear them. He was almost certainly right. No one had 6 months. The solution came from an unlikely corner of the war. By 1945, Women's Army Corps had been serving in theater for nearly 2 years, but the Army's racial segregation policy had largely kept black servicewomen on the far margins of the effort. Then, after pressure from civil rights leaders and members of Congress, after a direct appeal that made its way to Eleanor Roosevelt, and eventually to the War Department, the Army authorized the deployment of a unit that had no precedent, an all-black, all-female battalion, to be sent overseas for the first time in the war's history. Their mission was to go to Birmingham and clear the warehouses. The 6th 888th Central Postal Directory Battalion, 855 women, the only unit of its kind in the entire war. They would be known as the 6888. Commanding them was Major Charity Adams, 26 years old, a pastor's daughter from South Carolina, and the first African-American woman to be commissioned as an officer in the Women's Army Corps. She had earned her rank inside an institution that had spent years telling women like her they had no place in it. When the assignment came, she took it without hesitation. On February 3, 1945, the 6888 set sail from New York aboard the Ile-de-France. The crossing was not easy. German U-boats were still hunting Allied shipping in the North Atlantic, and the ship zigzagged through winter seas to make itself a harder target. When the women arrived in Birmingham, they were greeted by cold warehouses, substandard living quarters, and doubt from nearly every officer who had been briefed on the mission. One general, inspecting the unit shortly after their arrival, reportedly suggested that white supervisors should be brought in to oversee the work. Major Adams declined. What the women found in those Birmingham warehouses was unlike anything most of them had imagined. The mail was not simply stacked, it was heaped, piled, buried under itself in conditions that made systematic sorting seem at first close to impossible. Some of it had been water damaged. Some of it was covered in the residue of a building that had taken bomb damage and been repaired without anyone moving the bags first. There were letters addressed to nicknames read, Shorty Chicago, with no other identifying information. Letters for men, whose names had been misspelled by a mother who had never learned to write with confidence and was doing her best anyway. Letters for men who had been transferred twice, hospitalized once, and promoted in the middle. Letters for men who had been captured. Letters for men who had died. And there were letters that had arrived on the front lines already stamped deceased in red and then been sent back. Those were the ones no one knew what to do with. The 6888 organized themselves into 3 shifts, 8 hours each, 7 days a week, working around the clock with no break on weekends. They built a tracking system that could locate a soldier using only partial information. A nickname, a unit fragment, a postmark, a handwriting peculiarity. They cross-referenced transfer records, casualty lists, and hospital manifests. The work was less like postal sorting and more like detection. They were reconstructing, out of a bureaucratic wreck, the human network the mail was supposed to serve. The general had said 6 months. They cleared the Birmingham warehouse in 3. There is no way to count the individual letters that passed through their hands. No way to know how many of the men who finally received a package from home. A tin of cookies gone stale, a photograph, a handwritten page with news of a dog in a neighbor's garden and a street corner that suddenly meant everything. Had been days or weeks from surrendering the idea that anyone remembered them. The historian Paul Fussell, who fought in France and wrote honestly about what combat did to a man, called letters indispensable. "We couldn't have won the war without it," he said of the mail. "It was terribly important as a motivator of the troops. Mail call, whenever it happened, was a delight." Soldiers wrote and testified and said for decades afterward that mail call was the one thing that returned them briefly to themselves, that hearing your name called out in a muddy field in France or on an airstrip carved into some Pacific island was evidence of something no ration and no dry pair of socks could substitute for. It was evidence that you still existed, that somewhere, someone was counting the days. To go without that, for weeks, for months, was to be erased in a way that no amount of physical comfort could compensate for. Men who stopped receiving mail began to doubt whether the world they were fighting for still had a place in it for them. That question, once it took root, had consequences commanders and chaplains and morale officers spent real effort trying to reverse. The 6888 understood it better than most. They worked 3 shifts a day because they understood exactly what was in those bags. After Birmingham, the battalion transferred to Rouen, France, where a second backlog was waiting, just as large, just as tangled. Some of the mail in Rouen had been sitting since 1942. The women sorted through it alongside French civilians and German prisoners of war, working in warehouses that were cold in winter and sweltering in summer, processing mail that had been written by men who no longer knew where they were going to be the following week. Some of the undeliverable letters required detective work that could take hours. Tracking a single soldier through a chain of reassignments, injuries, and unit reorganizations, all to deliver one page in a mother's handwriting. They finished the Rouen backlog in roughly 5 months. Then Paris. Then the gradual demobilization as the war wound down, and Europe began the long, painful work of becoming peacetime again. They came home to no parade, no public commendation broadcast to the nation. The army was still segregated, and the press covering returning heroes was largely looking somewhere else. The 688 quietly disbanded and went back to the lives they had suspended to cross the ocean. Some never spoke of it. A few spent the rest of their lives writing letters, still by force of habit, to people they had never met. The monument honoring them was dedicated at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, in 2018, more than 7 decades after the war ended. In 2025, Congress awarded the 6,888th the Congressional Gold Medal. By then, only 2 of the original 855 were still believed to be alive. Go back now to the letter in that Birmingham warehouse. The one addressed to the composite soldier, the young man from somewhere ordinary, who wrote home 6 times a week and kept every letter he received in a bundle in his breast pocket. The paper worn soft from rereading. He did not survive to stand at mail call one last time and hear his name. Thousands like him did not. But for every man who didn't make it, there were others who did, who stood in the cold at the end of a mail line, restored by women the army had doubted, in a country that had not yet learned to honor them, and opened an envelope that had spent months buried in a Birmingham warehouse before hours of someone's careful, painstaking labor had found the right unit, the right company, the right name on the right bag. That soldier may not have known how close he had come to never receiving it. He probably never knew about the 3 shifts, the 7-day weeks, the tracking system built by hand in an aircraft hangar in England. The letter itself rarely said anything extraordinary. It said the harvest was in and the first frost had come. The nights were long and quiet. The new baby had her father's eyes. It said, "We are fine. Come home soon." That was enough. That was everything. And it took 855 women in a cold English winter, working 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week, to make sure it arrived. The men who received those letters rarely knew who to thank. No one told them. The 688 preferred to let the letters speak for themselves. That, too, was a kind of valor.